never thought I'd be sitting here telling this story to strangers on the internet, but here I am. My hands are still shaking as I type this, 3 weeks after everything went down. The coffee beside me has gone cold twice already, and I keep having to stop to wipe my eyes. You see, when you marry a man with grown children, you think love will be enough. You think that being kind, patient, and respectful will eventually win them over. I was so naive, so desperately hopeful. My name is Margaret. I'm 67 years old, and for the past 15 years, I was married to Robert, a successful contractor from Ohio. When we met at a church potluck dinner on a warm September evening, I was a widow working as a school librarian, and he was this charming man who'd lost his wife to cancer 3 years prior. I remember exactly what he was wearing: a navy blue polo shirt that brought out his kind eyes, and khaki pants that were slightly wrinkled because he'd admitted later he'd ironed them himself, not trusting the dry cleaner with his good clothes. His son David was already 35 then, married with 2 young kids, living his own life in a ranch house about 20 minutes away. I thought we'd all get along just fine. How wrong I was. Robert had built a good life for himself through decades of hard work and honest dealing. The house we lived in was a beautiful colonial with white shutters and a wraparound porch, surrounded by maple trees that turned brilliant gold and crimson every fall. It sat on 2 acres of carefully maintained lawn with flower beds I'd planted and tended, and a vegetable garden where Robert grew the most incredible tomatoes, the kind of American dream home you see in movies, complete with a white picket fence and a mailbox shaped like a little house. He'd worked hard for everything he had. The construction business he'd built from nothing, starting with just a pickup truck and a toolbox, growing it into a company that employed 15 people. The savings account that represented 40 years of careful budgeting and smart investments. The retirement accounts he'd contributed to religiously, even during the lean years when the business was struggling. When we got married in a small ceremony at the Methodist Church, with just close friends and family present, I brought my own modest savings from my late husband's life insurance and my teacher's pension. I wasn't some gold digger looking for security. I had my own financial foundation, my own little nest egg that represented 30 years of working and saving. But David never accepted me. Not once in 15 years did he call me by my name. It was always her, or that woman, or sometimes, when he was feeling particularly cruel, Dad's mistake. At family gatherings, he'd talk around me like I was invisible, addressing his father directly while I sat right there. His wife Sarah would at least nod politely and make small talk about the weather or the kids' school activities. But David made it crystal clear I was an intruder in his father's life. Robert tried so hard to bridge the gap, bless his generous heart. He'd invite David over for Sunday dinners, hoping we'd bond over his famous barbecue ribs, a recipe he'd perfected over 20 years, and my homemade apple pie made from his mother's recipe. The smell of hickory smoke would fill our backyard, mixing with the scent of the honeysuckle that grew along our back fence. I'd set the table with my grandmother's china, the delicate blue and white pattern that had been in my family for 3 generations, trying so hard to make everything perfect, to create the kind of warm family atmosphere Robert craved. But David would sit there like a statue, answering his father's eager questions with one-word responses, checking his phone constantly, making it painfully obvious he couldn't wait to leave. He'd pick at my food, barely touching the meal I'd spent hours preparing, and leave as soon as he could politely escape. I told myself it didn't matter, that Robert's love was enough to sustain me. We had our quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and orange while the birds sang in our maple trees. We had our evening walks around the neighborhood, waving to Mrs. Henderson as she watered her prize-winning petunias, stopping to chat with the Johnsons about their new grandchild, or the Millers about their upcoming anniversary. But last December, when Robert had his massive heart attack while shoveling snow from our driveway, everything changed in an instant. As I held his cold hand in that sterile hospital room, listening to the steady beep of machines that were keeping him alive, watching his chest rise and fall with mechanical precision, I saw something in David's eyes that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't grief, it was calculation. Cold, measuring calculation, like he was already dividing up his father's possessions in his mind. The funeral was on a gray January morning, the kind where the Ohio sky looks like wet concrete and the wind cuts right through your coat no matter how many layers you wear. I stood there in my black dress, the one Robert always said made me look elegant and distinguished, watching them lower my husband into the frozen ground of Riverside Cemetery. The Methodist church had been packed to overflowing. Robert knew everyone in town after 40 years of building their homes, fixing their roofs, renovating their kitchens, being an integral part of their lives and dreams. Pastor Williams had delivered a beautiful eulogy, talking about Robert's integrity, his craftsmanship, his devotion to his community. The church ladies had prepared a lunch afterward, with casseroles and sandwich platters and enough desserts to feed an army. People kept coming up to me, sharing memories of Robert, telling me how he'd helped them through difficult times, how he'd always been fair and honest in his dealings. But even in my overwhelming grief, I felt David's eyes on me constantly, cold, assessing eyes that seemed to be measuring everything. The flowers I'd chosen, white lilies, Robert's favorite, the hymns I'd selected, Amazing Grace and How Great Thou Art, even the tears streaming down my cheeks. During the service, when Pastor Williams spoke about Robert's love for his family, emphasizing how happy he'd been in his second marriage, David's jaw tightened visibly every time he mentioned me as Robert's beloved wife. I noticed him whispering to his wife, Sarah, during the reception, their heads bent together in intense conversation while I accepted condolences from Robert's friends and business associates. Several times I caught him staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between contempt and anticipation that made my stomach churn. The real blow came 3 days later, on a Thursday morning that dawned clear and bitterly cold. I was still in my pajamas at noon, unable to face the task of getting dressed, when David showed up at the front door with a manila envelope clutched in his hand. The January wind whipped through the bare oak trees as he stood on the porch I'd swept 1,000 times, the porch where Robert and I had shared our morning coffee and planned our days just weeks before. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't acknowledge that I'd just buried the love of my life, that I was drowning in grief and loneliness. He just stood there in his expensive wool coat, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, and got straight to business. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat and businesslike, not even offering the pretense of sympathy. He handed me papers, legal documents with official letterheads and dense paragraphs of legal jargon that I could barely focus on through my tears. The words swam on the page as I tried to make sense of what I was reading. "I'm contesting the will," he announced, as casually as if he were discussing the weather forecast. "This house, the business, the bank accounts, the retirement funds, they should go to blood family. You were only married 15 years. I'm his son, his flesh and blood. I have a legitimate claim to his estate." I felt like I'd been physically slapped, the breath knocked out of my lungs. The living room suddenly felt foreign and hostile. The burgundy leather sofa Robert had been so proud of, saving up for months to buy it. The family photos on the mantel that included pictures of David's children at Christmas morning and birthday parties. The grandfather clock that had belonged to Robert's parents and chimed every hour with a melody that had become the soundtrack of our life together. Everything we'd built together, everything Robert had specifically wanted me to have so I'd be secure and comfortable in my old age, was being challenged by his own son. Robert left everything to me in his will, I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible, my throat tight with unshed tears. He made his wishes very clear. He wanted me to be taken care of. David's laugh was harsh and bitter, a sound that made me flinch. "We'll see about that in court. I've got a lawyer, and I know Dad wasn't thinking clearly those last few months. His judgment was compromised by his illness, by his medications. You probably influenced him, manipulated a sick old man when he was vulnerable." The accusation hit me like a physical blow, stealing what little breath I had left. Manipulated? I'd spent 15 years loving Robert unconditionally, caring for him through his diabetes and high blood pressure, being his partner in every sense of the word. When his arthritis flared up during the cold Ohio winters, I'd rub his swollen hands with liniment and help him with buttons and zippers. When he couldn't sleep because of worry about the business, I'd make him chamomile tea and sit with him until dawn, listening to his concerns and helping him work through problems. After David left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows, I sat in Robert's favorite recliner, surrounded by the oppressive silence of our home. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune. The grandfather clock ticked away the seconds. Outside, Snow began to fall again, covering the garden where Robert and I had planted roses together last spring, burying the dormant flower beds under a blanket of white. That's when I realized, with crystal clarity, that David had come prepared for war. He'd probably been planning this challenge since the moment his father drew his last breath. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that his stepmother wasn't going to be the helpless, grieving victim he expected. What would you do in my place? Would you fight back against such cruelty, or would you let them take everything your husband worked for and wanted you to have? Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments, because what happened next changed everything. And David was about to learn he'd picked the wrong woman to mess with. The weeks that followed were the darkest of my entire life, darker even than when I'd lost my first husband to cancer 25 years earlier. This wasn't just grief, though Lord knows that pain felt like it would swallow me whole, leaving me gasping for air in the middle of the night. This was grief compounded by betrayal, by the crushing realization that the stepson I'd tried so hard to love was willing to destroy me to get what he wanted. I'd wake up each morning in our king-size bed, instinctively reaching for Robert's warm body, only to find cold, empty sheets that still smelled faintly of his cologne. The house felt enormous and hollow, every room echoing with memories. I'd wander from room to room like a ghost, touching things that had been ours together. His reading glasses still folded on the nightstand, his coffee mug still in the dishwasher because I couldn't bear to put it away, his favorite sweater still hanging in the closet. Every creak of the old floorboards, every whistle of winter wind through the windows reminded me I was utterly alone. I'd make coffee for one instead of two, toast one slice of bread instead of the 4 pieces Robert would demolish with butter and jam, and sit at our kitchen table staring at the empty chair across from me where he used to read the morning paper and complain about the government. But David's lawyer wasted no time launching his attack. Papers kept arriving like clockwork, certified mail that made my heart race every time I heard the mailman's truck rumbling up our gravel driveway. Depositions scheduled for dates that seemed impossibly soon. Asset freezes requested that would lock up accounts I needed to pay basic bills. Interrogatories filled with invasive questions about my undue influence over Robert in his final years, about my financial motivations for marrying him, about every conversation we'd had regarding his will and estate planning. The legal language was deliberately intimidating, designed to make me feel small and helpless and overwhelmed. Terms like tortious interference and constructive fraud that I had to look up online, sitting at Robert's computer in his study, surrounded by his business files and the smell of his pipe tobacco. The worst part was how it changed the way people in our small town looked at me. At the Kroger, where I'd shopped for 15 years, I'd catch whispers behind the cereal aisle, conversations that stopped abruptly when I rounded the corner. "That's the woman whose stepson is fighting her for the inheritance," I heard Mrs. Patterson from the post office tell her sister. I heard she manipulated that poor man on his deathbed. At church, where Robert and I had attended services together every Sunday, sitting in the same pew for over a decade, conversations would halt when I walked by. People who'd been friendly for years suddenly found reasons to avoid eye contact, to hurry past without their usual warm greetings. The church ladies who'd organized meals after Robert's funeral now seemed uncomfortable around me, as if grief and legal troubles were contagious. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been my neighbor for 15 years, who'd borrowed cups of sugar and shared garden vegetables over the fence, suddenly found reasons to go inside whenever I appeared on my porch. The Johnsons, who'd invited us to their anniversary party just last summer, crossed the street rather than walk past my house during their evening stroll. David had made sure everyone in town knew his version of the story, painting himself as the poor, grieving son fighting to protect his father's legacy from the gold-digging second wife. Never mind that I'd worked my whole adult life, that I'd brought my own assets to the marriage, that Robert and I had been genuinely, visibly happy together for 15 years. The stress began eating me alive from the inside out. I started having panic attacks, real ones, where I couldn't breathe and my chest felt like someone was sitting on it with the full weight of their body. I'd find myself hyperventilating in the produce section of Kroger, gripping a bag of apples so tightly my knuckles went white, or sitting in my Honda Civic in the church parking lot, unable to make myself go inside for Sunday service. My appetite disappeared completely, food tasted like cardboard, and my clothes began hanging loose on my shrinking frame. I'd catch glimpses of myself in mirrors and be shocked by the hollow-eyed stranger staring back at me. My lawyer, a kind man named Mr. Peterson, who'd handled Robert's business affairs for over 20 years, tried his best to be reassuring during our meetings in his downtown office. "The will is solid, Margaret. Robert was of sound mind when he wrote it. We have witnesses, medical records, everything we need to prove his competency." But even he looked worried when David's attorney filed motion after motion, each one more aggressive and personal than the last. 3 weeks after the funeral, on a particularly brutal February day when the wind chill made it feel like 20 below zero, David showed up again. This time, he brought reinforcements: Sarah and their 2 teenagers, Robert's grandchildren, whom I'd watched grow up, whom I'd bought Christmas and birthday presents for, whom I'd cheered at soccer games and school plays and piano recitals. Grandma Margaret, little Emma had always called me, running to hug me whenever they visited. But that day, she wouldn't even look at me, her young face set in lines too hard for a 14-year-old. David stood in my living room, in the house where I'd lived as Robert's wife for 15 years, and made what he called his final, generous offer. "Take 50,000 and walk away," he said, his voice cold and businesslike. "Sign a release, give up any claim to Dad's estate, and you can start over somewhere else." That's more than generous for someone who was only in Dad's life for 15 years. $50,000, out of an estate worth over $2 million, for a woman who'd loved their father with every fiber of her being, who'd cared for him through illness and worry, who'd held his hand as he took his last breath. I looked at Sarah, desperately hoping for some support, some acknowledgement of the years we'd shared family dinners and holiday celebrations, some recognition that I'd genuinely loved her father-in-law. But she just stared at her hands, unable or unwilling to meet my eyes. That night, after they left and the house fell silent again, I sat in Robert's study, surrounded by his things, his reading glasses still on the desk where he'd left them, his favorite coffee mug still unwashed in the kitchen sink, his cologne still faintly scenting the air. The walls were lined with photos of construction projects he'd completed, awards from the Chamber of Commerce, certificates of appreciation from various charities he'd supported. That's when I made a decision that would change everything, that would shift the balance of power in this ugly war David had declared. I wasn't going to be the victim in this story. David thought he was dealing with a helpless, grieving old widow, but he had absolutely no idea who he was really fighting. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with that particular quality of winter light that makes everything look sharp and defined. For the first time since Robert's funeral, I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I got dressed properly. Not just thrown on clothes grabbed from the closet in my grief-stricken haze, but really, carefully dressed. I put on my navy blue suit, the one Robert always said made me look like I could run a Fortune 500 company, paired it with my good pearls and my most comfortable heels. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror in our bedroom, seeing not the broken widow I'd become, but glimpses of the competent woman I'd always been. The woman who'd managed a school library for 20 years, who'd balanced budgets and supervised staff, and dealt with difficult parents and administrators. The woman who'd worked as a bookkeeper before that, understanding financial statements and legal documents and complex business arrangements. I drove through the familiar streets of our town to the bank where Robert and I had done business for 20 years, past the houses he'd built or renovated, past the park where we'd walked our golden retriever Rex before he passed away last year. The February sun was trying to break through the gray clouds, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe properly, like there was actual oxygen reaching my lungs. Mr. Williams, the branch manager, had known Robert since they were both young men starting out in life with more ambition than capital. He'd approved Robert's first business loan when the company was just Robert and a pickup truck, had been there for every expansion, every success, every challenge over the decades. When I walked into his corner office that Tuesday morning, his weathered face was full of genuine sympathy. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm so sorry for your loss. Robert was a good man, one of the finest customers we ever had the privilege to serve. He built half this town, and he did it with integrity and craftsmanship that's rare these days." I sat across from his desk, my purse clutched in my lap, and told him about David's legal challenge. About the asset freezes his lawyer was requesting that would lock up accounts I needed to pay basic living expenses. About how they were trying to paint me as some kind of manipulative gold digger who'd taken advantage of a vulnerable old man. Mr. Williams frowned deeply, his bushy eyebrows drawing together as he pulled up our accounts on his computer screen. That's absolutely ridiculous, Margaret. You and Robert managed your finances together for years like the partnership you were. You both signed everything, made decisions together, consulted each other on every major purchase or investment. I have records of every transaction, every meeting, every financial decision you made as a couple. He scrolled through screens of data, shaking his head. Robert was sharp as a tack, right up until the end. Just last month, he was in here asking about CD rates and discussing his retirement planning. There was nothing wrong with his mental capacity, nothing that would suggest he was being influenced or coerced. That's when I asked the question that had been forming in my mind since David's insulting ultimatum, the question that represented my first real step toward fighting back. What if I wanted to move some of my personal assets, money that was mine before I married Robert, money that came from my first husband's life insurance and my own retirement savings? Mr. Williams nodded slowly, understanding immediately what I was asking and why. That's completely within your rights, Margaret. Those funds were never commingled with Robert's estate assets. They've remained in your separate account all these years, exactly as you and Robert set it up when you got married. He pulled up another screen, showing me the account that had sat largely untouched for 15 years. You were very wise to keep these funds separate. Robert insisted on it, if I remember correctly. He said you should always have something that was unquestionably, legally yours. $500,000. That's what I'd brought to the marriage. Money from my first husband's life insurance policy, my teacher's pension that I'd rolled over, and my own retirement savings accumulated over 30 years of working and careful budgeting. Money I'd never touched, because Robert's income had been more than sufficient for our needs. Money Robert had insisted I keep separate, just in case something happens to me. At the time, I'd thought he was being overly cautious, maybe even a little morbid. We were married, we were partners, what was mine was his, and vice versa. But Robert, with his practical contractor's mind and his experience of how families could turn ugly over money, had been thinking ahead. He'd seen how his first wife's relatives had treated him after she died, how they'd questioned every decision, every expense, every choice he'd made during her illness. He'd made sure I'd always have something that was unquestionably, legally, indisputably mine. The transfer took less than an hour, but it felt like the most important hour of my life since Robert's death. $500,000 moved from our local bank to a new account at a different institution across town. A bank where David had no connections, no friends, no influence. All completely legal, all completely within my rights as the sole account holder, all perfectly documented with proper paperwork and official records. I drove home through the familiar neighborhoods, past the elementary school where I'd worked for 2 decades, past the coffee shop where Robert and I used to meet for lunch on Saturdays. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, casting everything in golden light that made the snow-covered landscape look almost magical. That evening, I called my sister Linda in Florida, the only family I had left who truly understood what Robert had meant to me. She'd been worried sick about me, calling every few days to check in, offering to fly up and stay with me through the legal proceedings, sending care packages filled with homemade cookies and encouraging notes. I did something today, I told her, standing in my kitchen as the sun set behind the bare trees in our backyard, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that reminded me of the sunrises Robert and I used to watch together. What kind of something? Linda asked, and I could hear the curiosity and hope in her voice. The kind that's going to make David very, very angry when he finds out. Linda was quiet for a moment, processing what I'd said. Then she started laughing, really laughing, the kind of deep belly laugh we used to share as girls growing up in Michigan, getting into mischief and covering for each other. Good for you, Maggie. It's about damn time you reminded that spoiled boy who he's dealing with. As I hung up the phone, I looked around the house Robert and I had shared, seeing it with new eyes. Tomorrow, David's lawyer would discover that $500,000 had mysteriously disappeared from the accounts he was so eager to freeze and control. He'd learned that his stepmother wasn't the helpless, naive victim he'd assumed she was. The war was just beginning, but now I had ammunition he didn't know existed, and the element of surprise was entirely on my side. What would you do if someone tried to steal your security, your future, everything your spouse had worked for and wanted you to have? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because the story gets even more interesting from here, and David is about to learn some very hard lessons about underestimating the wrong woman. The phone call came on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after I'd moved the money, at precisely 9:47 a.m., according to the kitchen clock Robert had installed when we remodeled 5 years ago. I was in the kitchen making my morning coffee, still just 1 cup, still getting used to the profound loneliness that seemed to echo through every room of our house, when my lawyer, Mr. Peterson, called with barely contained amusement in his voice. "Margaret, we need to talk urgently. David's attorney just contacted me about an hour ago, and well, let's just say he's not happy at all." I could hear Mr. Peterson trying to maintain his professional composure, but there was definitely a note of satisfaction in his tone that made me smile for the first time in days. What seems to be the problem? Apparently, they've discovered that certain assets they expected to find in the estate accounts are no longer there. They're demanding an immediate explanation and threatening all sorts of legal action. I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring both the warmth and the moment, looking out at the bird feeder Robert had installed outside our kitchen window last spring. A bright red cardinal was perched there, a splash of brilliant color against the gray February morning, and I took it as a good omen. I moved my personal funds to a different bank, money that was never part of Robert's estate to begin with. That's exactly what I told them, in very clear legal terms. But David's lawyer is claiming you're hiding assets, trying to defraud the estate, engaging in what he called suspicious financial activity designed to circumvent the legal process. Can they do anything about it legally? Mr. Peterson chuckled, a sound I hadn't heard from him since before Robert's death. Not a damn thing, if you'll pardon my language, Margaret. That money was yours before you married Robert. It stayed in your name throughout the marriage with proper documentation, and you have every legal right to do whatever you want with it. They can huff and puff all they want, but they can't touch those funds. After I hung up, I sat in Robert's favorite recliner and allowed myself a small but genuine smile. The first real smile I'd had since the funeral. The first moment of actual satisfaction in this nightmare that had become my life. David had been so confident, so absolutely certain he could intimidate me into accepting his insulting $50,000 offer. He'd counted on me being a grieving, helpless widow who didn't understand finances or legal rights, who would crumble under pressure and sign whatever papers he put in front of me. But what David didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn in 15 years of treating me like I was invisible, was that before I became a librarian, I'd worked for 10 years as a bookkeeper for Morrison, Peterson & Associates, the largest law firm in our county. I understood contracts, estate law, asset protection, and financial planning. Robert used to joke that I was the brains behind his business success, helping him structure deals and understand complex financial arrangements that kept his company profitable and legally protected. The next few days were absolutely fascinating to watch unfold. David showed up at my door twice, his face red with anger and frustration, demanding to know where his father's money had gone. The first time, I let him rant on the front porch while I stood safely behind the screen door. The second time, I didn't even bother opening the door. "That money was never your father's," I told him through the locked door, my voice calm and steady. "It was mine before I married him, and it's mine now. Completely separate assets that have nothing to do with his estate." "You can't hide assets during a legal proceeding," he shouted, loud enough that Mrs. Henderson came out on her porch to see what the commotion was about. "I'm not hiding anything, David. I moved my personal funds to protect them from frivolous legal challenges. Completely legal, completely within my rights, and completely documented with proper paperwork." I watched through the window as he stormed back to his truck, his shoulders rigid with fury, his hands clenched into fists. For 15 years, he'd treated me like I was some helpless woman who'd gotten lucky when his father married me, like I was too stupid to understand money or business or legal matters. Now he was learning that his stepmother had more backbone, more intelligence, and more strategic thinking than he'd ever imagined. But the real test came the following week, when I had to face the extended family and community at Robert's memorial service at the VFW Hall. Robert had been a Vietnam veteran, and his Army buddies wanted to honor him properly with a military ceremony. I'd organized the entire event, The flowers, red, white, and blue arrangements. The food, Robert's favorite dishes prepared by the church ladies. The photo displays showing Robert's life from his army service, through his construction career, to our wedding day. The hall was packed with people who'd known Robert for decades. His employees, his clients, his fellow veterans, neighbors, church members. I'd spent hours preparing my speech, wanting to honor Robert's memory properly while also showing this community exactly who I was and what our marriage had meant. David and Sarah arrived with their kids, and I could feel the tension the moment they walked through the door. The whole room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen. These were people who'd known Robert for decades, who'd watched our marriage develop, who'd seen how genuinely happy we were together. I stood up to give my speech about Robert, my hands steady as I held the microphone, my voice clear and strong. I talked about his kindness and generosity, his incredible work ethic, his love for his family, including David. Despite everything, I shared stories about his terrible dad jokes that made everyone groan, his obsession with fixing things that weren't actually broken, his habit of leaving coffee cups all over the house and then spending 20 minutes looking for them. I talked about his pride in his son, how he'd brag about David's success in sales, how he'd kept every Father's Day card David had ever given him in a special box in his study. I mentioned how much he'd loved being a grandfather, how his face would light up whenever Emma and Jake visited. When I finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even Sarah was crying, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. But David sat, stone-faced throughout my entire speech, his arms crossed defensively, unmoved by the memories of his father that had everyone else reaching for their handkerchiefs. That's when Robert's best friend Tom stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Tom was a big man, a retired police officer who'd known Robert since they served together in Vietnam, who'd been best man at our wedding. His voice carried easily across the suddenly silent room. "I got something to say," Tom announced, his weathered face serious. "Robert Patterson was my brother in every way that mattered. We served together, worked together, shared our lives for over 40 years. And in all the years I knew him, through his first marriage and after he lost Carol, I never saw him happier than he was with Margaret." The room was completely silent, everyone hanging on Tom's words. She didn't marry him for his money. Hell, she had her own money, her own career, her own life. She married him for love, pure and simple, and anyone with eyes could see it. Robert used to call me just to tell me about something sweet Margaret had done, some way she'd surprised him or made him laugh. That man was happier in his second marriage than most people ever get to be in their whole lives. The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. "Mrs. Henderson nodded vigorously from her seat in the front row. Pastor Williams smiled and nodded. Even some of David's own friends and co-workers looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact with him. As people began to leave offering me hugs and condolences, Tom pulled me aside near the memorial display. "You need anything, Margaret, anything at all. You call me day or night. Robert made me promise to look after you, and I intend to keep that promise. And don't you let that boy intimidate you. His father would be ashamed of how he's treating you." That night, I sat in my quiet house, surrounded by sympathy cards and leftover casseroles from the memorial service, feeling something I hadn't felt since Robert's death: hope. I thought about David's shocked face when Tom had spoken up, about the way the community had rallied around me, about the nods of agreement and supportive comments I'd received. David thought he could isolate me, make me feel like an outsider with no support, no allies, no one who would stand up for me. But he was about to learn that his father's widow had more friends, more respect, and more community support than he'd ever imagined. And the $500,000 he was so angry about? That was just the beginning of the surprises I had in store for him. 2 months after the memorial service, I was sitting in my lawyer's office on a bright April morning when Mr. Peterson delivered the news that would change everything. The spring sunshine was streaming through his windows, and I could see the courthouse square coming to life with people heading to work, completely unaware that my life was about to take a dramatic turn. "Margaret, I have some interesting information about David's financial situation," Mr. Peterson said, sliding a folder across his mahogany desk. "My investigator has been doing some digging, and what we've found is quite revealing." I opened the folder with trembling hands, not sure what to expect. Inside were bank statements, credit reports, and legal documents that painted a very different picture of my stepson than the successful businessman he pretended to be. David was drowning in debt, credit card bills totaling over $80,000, a second mortgage on his house, car payments he was behind on, and business loans that were in default. He's been living beyond his means for years, Mr. Peterson explained, pointing to highlighted sections of the documents. The sales job he's so proud of? He was actually fired 6 months ago for falsifying expense reports. He's been lying to everyone, including his wife, about his employment status. My hands shook as I read through the papers. David hadn't just been greedy when he challenged Robert's will. He'd been desperate. He needed Robert's money to save himself from financial ruin, to keep his house, to maintain the lifestyle he'd been faking for years. "There's more," Mr. Peterson continued, his voice taking on a tone of satisfaction I'd never heard before. "Remember that business loan Robert co-signed for David 5 years ago? The one for $200,000 to help him start his consulting business?" I nodded, remembering how proud Robert had been to help his son, how he'd talked about it being an investment in David's future. David defaulted on that loan 3 months ago. The bank has been trying to collect from Robert's estate, but since Robert's assets are tied up in probate because of David's challenge, they can't touch them. However, Mr. Peterson paused dramatically. Your personal assets, the ones you moved to the other bank, are completely separate and protected. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. David's greed in challenging the will had actually protected me from his financial disasters. If he'd accepted Robert's will as written, the estate would have been settled months ago, and the bank could have claimed their money from Robert's accounts. Instead, his legal challenge had frozen everything, leaving the bank with no recourse except to pursue David personally. "What does this mean?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand the beautiful justice of the situation. "It means David is about to lose everything. His house, his cars, probably his marriage when Sarah finds out the truth about their finances. And the money he's been fighting so hard to get? It's going to be tied up in legal proceedings for months, maybe years, while he spirals deeper into debt." That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where Robert was buried, carrying a bouquet of daffodils from our garden. The spring air was warm and sweet, filled with the promise of new beginnings. I sat on the stone bench near his grave and told him everything, just like I used to tell him about my day when he'd come home from work. "Your son is about to learn some hard lessons about consequences," I whispered to his headstone. "I wish you were here to see it, but I think you'd be proud of how I'm handling this." The next morning, I put my plan into action. I called Tom, Robert's best friend, and asked him to meet me for coffee at the diner downtown. When I told him what I'd learned about David's situation, his weathered face broke into a grin. "Robert always said you were smarter than you let on," Tom chuckled. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to make some phone calls. David's been telling everyone in town that I'm a gold digger who manipulated his father. It's time people knew the truth about who's really been lying." Tom's network of friends and fellow veterans was extensive and loyal. Within 48 hours, word had spread throughout our small town about David's real financial situation, his job loss, his lies to his family. The same gossip network that had been whispering about me was now buzzing with the truth about Robert's son. 3 days later, David showed up at my door again, but this time he looked different. Gone was the arrogant confidence, the cold calculation. He looked haggard, desperate, like a man who'd been backed into a corner with no way out. "I know you know," he said without preamble, his voice hoarse, "about the business, about the money I owe." I stood in my doorway, looking at this man who'd made my life hell for months, who'd tried to destroy my reputation and steal my security. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "I know a lot of things, David. I know you've been lying to your wife about losing your job. I know you're about to lose your house. I know you defaulted on the loan your father co-signed, the loan that's now threatening what's left of his legacy." His face crumpled, and for the first time since I'd known him, David looked like the scared little boy he must have been once upon a time. "I need that inheritance, Margaret. I'm drowning here. My marriage is falling apart. My kids don't respect me. I've lost everything. And you thought destroying me would solve your problems? I thought you didn't deserve it. You weren't his real family." The words hung in the air between us, finally spoken aloud after 15 years of resentment and rejection. "Your father loved me, David, really loved me, and I loved him with everything I had. That made me real family. whether you accepted it or not. I watched as the last of his fight drained out of him, leaving behind a broken man who'd gambled everything on greed and lost. What would you do if you held all the cards against someone who'd tried to destroy you? Would you show mercy, or would you let justice take its course? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because the final confrontation is coming, and it's going to change everything. The revelation of David's financial ruin spread through our small town like wildfire, carried by the same network of gossips who'd been whispering about me for months. Suddenly, the narrative had completely flipped. Instead of the grieving son fighting to protect his father's legacy, David was now seen as the desperate debtor who'd tried to steal from his stepmother to cover his own mistakes. I was at the grocery store on a Tuesday morning, selecting apples in the produce section, when I overheard Mrs. Patterson from the post office talking to her sister near the bananas. Can you believe it? That poor woman has been dealing with all this legal nonsense while that boy was lying about everything. Robert must be rolling in his grave, knowing his son turned out to be such a disappointment. For the first time in months, people were looking at me with sympathy instead of suspicion. The church ladies who'd been avoiding me suddenly remembered how much they'd always liked me. Neighbors who'd been crossing the street to avoid awkward conversations were now stopping to ask how I was holding up. But the real vindication came from an unexpected source. Sarah, David's wife, called me on a Thursday evening just as I was finishing a solitary dinner of leftover pot roast. "Margaret, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice shaky and tearful. "Can I come over?" 20 minutes later, Sarah was sitting in my living room, clutching a tissue and looking like she'd aged 10 years in the past few weeks. Her usually perfect makeup was smudged, her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her hands shook as she tried to compose herself. "I didn't know," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "About the job, about the debts, about any of it. David's been lying to me for months, maybe years. I found out when the bank called about foreclosure proceedings." I poured her a cup of tea, the same chamomile blend I used to make for Robert when he couldn't sleep, and waited for her to continue. "The kids are asking questions I can't answer. Emma wants to know why we might have to move, why Daddy seems so angry all the time. Jake heard David on the phone with lawyers, screaming about money." Sarah's voice broke completely. "I never supported what he was doing to you, Margaret. I should have spoken up, should have told him he was wrong, but I was a coward." "You were trying to support your husband," I said gently, surprising myself with how little anger I felt toward her. "That's what wives do. But you didn't deserve what we put you through. Robert loved you so much, anyone could see it. David was he was jealous, I think. Jealous that his father had found happiness again. Jealous that you made Robert smile in ways his mother never could." Sarah's admission hung in the air between us, finally giving voice to what I'd suspected for years. David's resentment hadn't really been about money or inheritance. It had been about his father's happiness with me, happiness that somehow diminished his memories of his mother. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I'm taking the kids to my mother's in Cincinnati. I can't watch David destroy himself anymore, and I won't let him destroy our children too." She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "I'm filing for divorce." The next morning brought another surprise. Mr. Peterson called to inform me that David had fired his lawyer and was requesting a meeting to discuss settlement options. The man who'd been so confident about contesting Robert's will was now looking for a way out of the legal battle he'd started. "He's desperate, Margaret. His house is going into foreclosure next month, his credit is destroyed, and now his wife is leaving him. He knows he can't win this fight, and he can't afford to keep fighting it." That afternoon, I found myself sitting across from David in Mr. Peterson's conference room, the same room where Robert and I had signed our wills years ago. David looked terrible, unshaven, wearing a wrinkled shirt, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep or too much drinking. Probably both. "I want to drop the contest," he said without preamble, his voice flat and defeated. "I'll sign whatever papers you need, acknowledge that the will is valid, whatever it takes to end this." "And in return?" Mr. Peterson asked, his pen poised over his legal pad. "I need help," David said, the words seeming to physically pain him. "The loan Dad co-signed, the one that's coming due. If the estate could cover it, I might be able to save my house, maybe convince Sarah to give me another chance." I studied this broken man across the table, this person who'd made my life hell for months, who'd tried to paint me as a manipulative gold digger, who'd turned my grief into a public spectacle. Part of me wanted to let him drown in the consequences of his own choices, But I could hear Robert's voice in my head, remembering how he'd talk about David with such hope and love, despite all the disappointments. He's still my son, Margaret. He's made mistakes, but he's still my boy. The loan is $200,000, I said slowly. Plus, interest and penalties, probably close to $250,000 now. I know it's a lot to ask, considering everything I've put you through. It is a lot to ask, I agreed. But I'm not doing this for you, David. I'm doing it because your father loved you, despite everything. He'd want me to help his son, even if his son never wanted my help. David's face crumpled, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw genuine remorse in his eyes. I'm sorry, Margaret. I'm so sorry for everything. I was wrong about you, wrong about Dad, wrong about everything. Yes, you were, I said simply. But we all make mistakes. The question is what we learn from them. As we signed the papers that would end the legal battle and save David's house, I thought about Robert and what he would have wanted. He'd have wanted his son to learn from this experience, to become a better man, a better father, a better human being. Whether David would actually learn those lessons remained to be seen, but I'd done what Robert would have wanted me to do, and that gave me a peace I hadn't felt since his death. The war was over, but the real test would be whether David could rebuild his life and his relationships with the second chance he'd been given. 6 months later, on a warm October morning that reminded me of the day Robert and I first met, I was tending to the roses in our garden when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I looked up to see David's truck, but this time he wasn't alone. Emma and Jake, Robert's grandchildren, tumbled out of the passenger side, their faces bright with excitement. "Grandma Margaret!" Emma called out, running toward me with the enthusiasm I remembered from before all the legal troubles began. At 15, she was becoming a beautiful young woman, with Robert's kind eyes and her mother's delicate features. Jake, now 13 and all arms and legs, followed more slowly, but his smile was genuine as he approached. "Hi, Grandma Margaret. Dad said we could visit if you wanted to see us." I set down my gardening gloves and hugged them both, feeling tears prick my eyes. These children had been caught in the middle of their parents' divorce and their father's financial crisis, but they seemed to be weathering the storm better than anyone had expected. David approached more cautiously, looking healthier than he had in months. He'd gained back some weight, his clothes were clean and pressed, and there was something different in his eyes. Humility, maybe, or the beginning of wisdom. "I hope it's okay that we came by," he said, his voice uncertain. "The kids have been asking about you, and I thought maybe it was time." "Of course it's okay," I said, meaning it. "You're always welcome here, all of you." We sat on the front porch, the same porch where Robert and I had shared our morning coffee for 15 years, and I listened as Emma and Jake told me about their new school in Cincinnati, about their mother's job at a marketing firm, about how they were adjusting to their parents' separation. "Mom says you and Grandpa Robert were really happy together," Emma said, with the directness that only teenagers possess. "She says Dad was wrong to be mean to you." David's face flushed red, but he didn't try to deflect or make excuses. "I was wrong about a lot of things," he said quietly. "I let my anger and jealousy hurt people I should have protected and respected." "Are you and Mom going to get back together?" Jake asked, his voice carefully neutral in the way children learn when their world has been turned upside down. David was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the maple trees that were just beginning to turn their brilliant fall colors. "I don't know, son. Your mother and I have a lot of work to do, a lot of trust to rebuild. But whether we get back together or not, I'm going to be a better father to you and Emma. That's a promise." After the children went inside to get drinks and see the house they remembered from holiday visits, David and I sat alone on the porch. The afternoon sun was warm on our faces, and the silence between us was comfortable for the first time in years. "I've been going to counseling," David said suddenly. "Anger management, financial planning, family therapy when the kids visit. I'm trying to figure out how I became the kind of man who would attack his father's widow." "And what have you learned?" I asked. "That I was angry at the wrong person for the wrong reasons. I was angry at Dad for being happy with you because it felt like a betrayal of my mother's memory. I was angry at you for being everything she wasn't, patient, supportive, genuinely content with a quiet life, and I was angry at myself for not being the son Dad deserved." His honesty was startling, and I found myself really listening to him for the first time since I'd known him. "Your father talked about you constantly," I told him. "He was so proud of you even when you were struggling. He used to say you had his stubborn streak but your mother's intelligence, and that combination would take you far if you learned to channel it properly. David's eyes filled with tears. I wasted so much time being angry. I missed so many opportunities to really know him, to learn from him, to be the son he wanted me to be. It's not too late to be the father he'd want you to be, I said gently. Emma and Jake need you to be better than you were. They need you to show them how to handle failure, how to make amends, how to rebuild after you've made mistakes. We talked for another hour, really talked, about Robert and grief and family and forgiveness. When it was time for them to leave, David hesitated at the bottom of the porch steps. Margaret, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but would you consider being part of the kids' lives again? Not as their step-grandmother or anything official, just as someone who loved their grandfather and wants to share those memories with them? I looked at Emma and Jake waiting in the truck, these children who carried Robert's DNA and his smile, and I felt something shift in my chest. The anger I'd been carrying for months, the hurt and resentment, began to dissolve like sugar in warm water. I'd like that very much, I said. Your father would want his grandchildren to know how much he loved them, and I have 15 years of stories to share. As they drove away, Emma waving from the passenger window, I sat back down in Robert's favorite porch chair and felt something I hadn't experienced since his death: hope for the future. Not just my future, but David's future, the children's future, the possibility that this family could heal and grow stronger from the pain they'd endured. The legal battle was over, but more importantly, the war between David and me was finally ending. We'd never be close friends, probably never be a traditional family, but we could be something better than enemies. We could be people who'd learned from their mistakes and chosen forgiveness over bitterness. Robert would have been proud of that choice. He'd always believed in second chances, in the power of love to overcome hurt, in the possibility that people could change and grow and become better versions of themselves. What would you do if someone who'd hurt you deeply asked for forgiveness and a chance to rebuild? Would you take the risk of trusting again? Or would you protect yourself from further disappointment? Let me know in the comments and make sure you're subscribed, because the final chapter of this story will show you how choosing forgiveness can transform everyone involved. 1 year later, I was standing in the kitchen of my new home, a charming cottage just 2 blocks from the house Robert and I had shared, putting the finishing touches on Thanksgiving dinner. The decision to sell the big house had been difficult, but it was time for a fresh start, time to create new memories instead of living surrounded by ghosts. The cottage was perfect for this new chapter of my life. 2 bedrooms, a cozy living room with a fireplace, and a kitchen that opened onto a small garden where I'd already planted roses. It was close enough to my old neighborhood that I could still walk to the cemetery to visit Robert, but far enough away that every corner didn't remind me of what I'd lost. The doorbell rang, and I smiled as I heard familiar voices on the front porch. Emma and Jake burst through the door, followed by David, and to my surprise, Sarah. She looked nervous but determined, her blonde hair shorter than I remembered, her face showing the strength that comes from surviving difficult times. "Grandma Margaret!" Jake called out, now 14 and shooting up like a weed. "Mom made her famous green bean casserole. And I brought the rolls Dad always liked," Emma added, holding up a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Sarah stepped forward hesitantly, holding a bottle of wine. "I hope it's okay that I came. David said you'd invited the whole family, and I thought maybe it was time we talked properly." "Of course it's okay," I said, taking the wine and giving her a gentle hug. "Robert always said Thanksgiving was about bringing family together, and you're part of this family whether we're all getting along or not." Over the past year, David had kept his promise to be a better father and a better man. He'd found a new job, paid off his debts, and slowly begun rebuilding his relationship with his children. Sarah had agreed to family counseling, and while they weren't back together, they were learning to co-parent effectively and treat each other with respect. As we gathered around my dining room table, the same table Robert and I had bought for our first apartment together 40 years ago, I looked at the faces surrounding me and felt overwhelmed with gratitude, not just for the obvious things like health and home and financial security, but for the harder lessons this year had taught me. I'd learned that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing bad behavior. It was about choosing not to let someone else's mistakes poison your own heart. I'd learned that strength sometimes looks like vulnerability, that standing up for yourself doesn't always mean fighting back, and that love can survive even the worst betrayals if you're willing to do the work. Before we eat, I said, raising my glass of wine, I want to say something. The table grew quiet, even Jake setting down his roll to listen. This year has been the hardest of my life, but it's also taught me things I never expected to learn. I've learned that family isn't just about blood or marriage certificates. It's about choosing to love each other, even when it's difficult. It's about showing up, making amends, and giving people room to grow and change. I looked directly at David, whose eyes were bright with unshed tears. I've learned that your grandfather's greatest gift wasn't his money or his house or his business. It was his belief that people could be better than their worst moments. He believed in second chances, in forgiveness, in the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. To Robert, Sarah said softly, raising her own glass. To Grandpa Robert, Emma and Jake echoed. To second chances, David added, his voice thick with emotion. We ate and talked and laughed, sharing stories about Robert that made him feel present at our table. Emma told us about the time he'd taught her to drive his pickup truck in the church parking lot when she was 12. Jake shared how Robert had helped him build a treehouse that was still standing in Sarah's backyard. David talked about learning construction skills from his father, memories that were clearly precious to him despite all the years of resentment. After dinner, as we were clearing the dishes, David pulled me aside. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth by years of handling. This was Dad's. I found it when I was going through his things at the office. I think he would have wanted you to have it. Inside the box were Robert's wedding ring, the one he'd worn every day of our marriage, and a folded piece of paper. With trembling hands, I unfolded the paper and recognized Robert's careful handwriting. Margaret, the note read, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably dealing with David's anger. Don't let him break your spirit, sweetheart. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I hope someday he'll be wise enough to see what a gift you've been to our family. Love always, Robert. The tears came then, not the bitter tears of grief and anger I'd shed so many times this year, but healing tears of love and closure. Robert had known what might happen, had tried to prepare me for it, had wanted me to know that his love for me was real and lasting. He wrote that 3 years ago, David said quietly, right after his first heart attack. I think he knew I might not handle things well if something happened to him. Thank you for giving this to me, I whispered, clutching the box to my chest. Thank you for not giving up on us, David replied, for showing us what Dad's love looked like in action. As the evening wound down and my guests prepared to leave, Emma hugged me tightly. Will you come to my graduation in the spring? She asked. I'm valedictorian, and I want you there. I wouldn't miss it for the world, I promised. Jake, not to be outdone by his sister, announced that he'd made the basketball team and wanted me to come to his games. Sarah mentioned that she'd love to have me over for dinner sometime, just the two of us, to talk about Robert and share memories. After they left, I sat in my new living room, surrounded by the comfortable silence of my cottage, holding Robert's wedding ring and reading his note one more time. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, the first snow of the season, covering my garden in pristine white. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, broken, angry, fighting for my survival against people who should have been my allies. I thought about the woman I was now, stronger, wiser, surrounded by a family that had learned to choose love over resentment. Robert's death had nearly destroyed me, but it had also revealed depths of strength I didn't know I possessed. David's betrayal had broken my heart, but it had also taught me the true meaning of forgiveness. The legal battle had threatened my security, but it had also shown me that I was capable of protecting myself and fighting for what was right. Most importantly, I'd learned that love doesn't end with death. Robert's love for me and mine for him had survived his passing and would continue to shape my choices and my relationships for the rest of my life. That love had been strong enough to heal a broken family, to bridge years of resentment, to create something beautiful from something that had seemed irreparably damaged. As I prepared for bed in my new home, I felt Robert's presence not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living part of who I'd become. His love had made me brave enough to fight for my rights, wise enough to forgive my enemies, and strong enough to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to choose love over fear. But tonight, I was at peace, surrounded by the warmth of family reconciled and the knowledge that some kinds of love are truly eternal. The end